He was a duke of ice and pride, until the young maid who feared him most became his only warmth. The heavy doors of Whitmere Hall creaked open, allowing winter's breath to scatter dried rose petals across the marble floor. Gaslight flickered against damask wallpaper, illuminating faces frozen in anticipation. The servants lined the entrance hall, eyes downcast, breath held in collective dread. None dared look directly at the figure standing at the center, a young woman, her hands trembling beneath worn gloves, clutching a brass candle holder as though it were her last defense against the shadow approaching from the grand staircase. "The girl cannot even light a proper fire," someone whispered. The housekeeper's voice cut through the silence like a blade on ice. "His Grace will not tolerate such incompetence." Leora Dane kept her gaze fixed on the flame she protected. 22 years of life had taught her that fear showed most in the eyes, and the Duke of Helwyn seemed to feed on it. The candle's glow caught the amber flecks in her gaze, highlighting the pallor of exhaustion on her face. 3 days she had worked without proper rest, attending to fires throughout the vast estate after 2 footmen had fallen ill. Now, her one failure, a hearth that refused to catch in the Duke's private study, had become her public humiliation. "She carries no skill and no worth," murmured Lady Winters, the Duke's widowed aunt who served as mistress of the household. The woman's fan snapped closed with a finality that echoed through the hall. The girl must be dismissed before the week's end. Whitmere Hall had not always been a place of whispers and cold judgment. Once paintings of summer gardens had adorned its walls, and music had drifted from its windows. But since the death of the Duchess 5 years prior, winter had settled into its very foundations. The Duke had forbidden fires in half the rooms, as though determined to match his surroundings to the temperature of his heart. The servants stilled as his footsteps descended. Even the ancient grandfather clock seemed to slow its pendulum in deference. Around Leora's neck hung a simple ribbon with a small brass key, her mother's last gift before consumption had claimed her. Her fingers closed around it now, seeking courage where there was only metal. Yet one gesture would change everything. The Duke of Helwyn appeared at the landing, tall and severe against the shadows. Elias Helwyn had been called handsome once, before grief had hollowed his cheeks and hardened the set of his jaw. His eyes, cold grey like winter sky before snow, surveyed the gathering with detached interest. At 36, he moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had taught himself to feel nothing. "Your Grace," Lady Winters curtsied deeply, her voice warming with artificial affection, "I have discovered the source of the chill in your study. This girl," she gestured toward Leora, "has proven herself inadequate to the simplest of tasks." The Duke's gaze fell upon Leora, who felt the weight of it, like frost upon her skin. His greatcoat, the colour of midnight, remained unbuttoned despite the cold, as though he alone were immune to winter's cruelty. "The fire would not catch, Your Grace," Lady Winters continued, "after 3 attempts. Surely such incompetence cannot be tolerated in a house of your standing." Around them, the servants exchanged glances. Dismissal in winter meant certain hardship, perhaps worse. Leora had no family, no connections, nothing but the position she had fought to secure after her mother's passing. "Look at me," the Duke commanded, his voice low and precise. Leora raised her eyes, expecting fury. Instead, she found something more unsettling, complete absence of emotion, as though he were regarding a broken teacup or a stained carpet. "Tell me, girl," he said, "why my study remains cold when your duty is to ensure warmth." The hall held its breath. Leora's voice emerged barely above a whisper, yet clear in the silence. "The chimney, Your Grace, it has not been swept this season. I discovered this only after my 3rd attempt." Lady Winters's fan opened again with a harsh snap. "Excuses are the refuge of the incompetent. The girl should have known—" "And who," the Duke interrupted, his gaze never leaving Leora's face, "is responsible for scheduling the chimney sweeps?" A chill more profound than any winter draft swept through the hall. Lady Winter's lips parted, but no sound emerged. "I believe," the Duke continued, "that responsibility falls to you, Aunt." The servant's eyes widened. None could recall the last time the Duke of Helwyn had contradicted his aunt in public. "The girl stays," he pronounced. His fingers touched the gold medallion at his throat, a gesture so brief it might have been imagined. "And my study shall be attended to properly tomorrow." With those words, he turned and ascended the stairs, leaving behind a wake of stunned silence. Only when the heavy door of his chambers closed did the hall release its collective breath. Leora's knees weakened with relief. The flame she had protected flickered, casting distorted shadows on the wall, light and darkness dancing in a pattern that seemed, for a moment, like the flutter of hope awakening. "This changes nothing," Lady Winters hissed as she passed. "Winter is long and his Grace's memory is short." But something had changed, for in the moment their eyes had met, Leora had glimpsed what no one else had seen. Beneath the Duke's icy demeanour, a crack in the glacier, and through that crack, the faintest glimmer of buried warmth. The candle trembled in her hand. Outside, snow began to fall against leaded glass, like memories trying to enter a heart long sealed against them. Whitmere Hall settled into night's embrace, unaware that the first notes of spring had been played in its master's voice. The library windows wept with condensation, winter's tears tracing paths down leaded glass. Leora moved between towering shelves, dust swirling in her wake like forgotten memories disturbed from slumber. Morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, creating islands of illumination amid seas of shadow. Her fingers traced leather spines reverently, lingering on gilt lettering worn thin by time and touch. "You need not whisper to books, Miss Dane. They have kept their secrets for centuries without your encouragement." Leora startled, nearly dropping the volume in her hands. The Duke of Halowen stood in the doorway, his form a dark silhouette against the brightness of the corridor. The medallion at his throat caught a stray beam of light, winking gold against the sombre palette of his attire. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she curtsied hastily. "I did not hear your approach." He entered the room like a man accustomed to navigating darkness, his steps measured and precise. 3 days had passed since the incident in the entrance hall, and whispers had spread through the servants' quarters. The Duke had not only spared the new firemaid, but had also ordered the immediate cleaning of every chimney in the east wing. "Do you read, Miss Dane?" The question emerged with faint surprise, as though the notion of literacy among the lower orders were a scientific curiosity. "My mother taught me, Your Grace." Leora returned the book to its place, acutely conscious of the contrast between her rough hands and the supple leather. She served as a governess before her health failed. The Duke moved to the window, his reflection fragmenting across the beveled panes. Outside, Whitmere's grounds stretched white and empty beneath a colourless sky. "And what brings you to my library, when your duties lie with hearths and candles?" Truth pressed against her lips, but prudence held it back. How could she explain that the library fires required tending 3 times daily, precisely because the Duke spent hours here, lost in volumes of astronomy and natural philosophy, that she had begun to mark the passage of time by which texts lay open upon his desk? "The fireplaces, Your Grace," she replied simply. "Lady Winters instructed that I check them hourly on days of particular cold." His eyebrow lifted slightly, the first expression she had seen cross his features. "My aunt appears suddenly concerned with warmth. How remarkable." A silence fell between them, not entirely uncomfortable. Leora noticed how his fingers absently stroked the medallion, a gesture that seemed unconscious, like a habit formed through grief rather than intention. "Your mother," he said at last, turning from the window. "What did she read to you?" The question caught her unprepared. Memories surfaced, a small room above a chandler's shop, tallow candles burning low, her mother's voice giving life to words on yellowed pages. "Poetry, Your Grace, and stories of distant places she had seen while in service to noble houses." Leora hesitated, then added softly, "She said books were windows when doors remained closed to us." Something shifted in the Duke's countenance, subtle as ice beginning to thaw, a nearly imperceptible softening around the eyes. "Indeed," he murmured, more to himself than to her. His gaze fell upon the volume she had returned to the shelf. With a movement both elegant and precise, he retrieved it. "Keats, an unusual choice for a firemaid." "The binding caught my eye, Your Grace." She did not add that she had been drawn to its worn edges, evidence that this book, unlike most in the vast collection, had been read and cherished rather than merely displayed. "In a drear-nighted December," he quoted without opening the pages, his voice taking on a quality she had not heard before, something almost musical beneath the frost. "Too happy, happy tree, thy branches ne'er remember their green felicity." The words hung in the air between them, freighted with meaning beyond their composition. For a breath, the distance between master and servant narrowed, bridged by verses neither had expected to share. The spell broke as the library door opened, admitting Lady Winters in a rustle of dark taffeta. Her gaze flickered between them, sharp with suspicion. "Nephew," she acknowledged, then turned cold eyes to Leora. "I was unaware that lighting fires now requires literary consultation." "Miss Dane was attending to her duties," the Duke replied, returning the volume to its place. "As we all must." Lady Winters' mouth tightened into a pale line. "Indeed." And speaking of duties, the solicitor awaits you in the study. The matter of the northern tenancies requires immediate attention. The farmers cannot pay what winter has not provided, he stated, his tone resuming its customary chill. The law stands regardless of season, Lady Winters countered. Your father understood this well. Something passed across the Duke's face, a shadow of old argument. Without another word, he moved toward the door, pausing only briefly beside Leora. See that this fire burns until evening, he instructed, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear the subtle emphasis. This one, particularly. After he departed, Lady Winters approached. The rustle of her dress like dead leaves scraped across stone. Curious attention from his grace, she observed, her voice silken with threat. I wonder what merit he sees in you that escaped my notice. Leora kept her expression neutral, though her pulse quickened with apprehension. I merely tend the fires, my lady. See that you remember your place, Lady Winters advised, reaching out to straighten an ornament on the mantelpiece. Winter claims many victims, child. The wise do not tempt its bite. When she too had gone, Leora knelt before the hearth, adding another log with care. The flames leaped higher, casting a warm glow upon the spine of the volume the Duke had held. She did not need to open it to recall the poem's conclusion, but were there ever any writhed in pain, envy would strike for them a different tale. Outside, a single raven alighted on the windowsill, its obsidian feathers gleaming against the snow-bright world. Like the Duke himself, it seemed both of the winter and apart from it, watching, waiting for something only it could perceive. The fire crackled, a secret language of light and heat. Leora added the coal, feeling, for the first time since entering Whitmere Hall, that she might have found a place where both body and spirit could be warmed. The north wing of Whitmere Hall had remained sealed since the Duchess's death, its corridors unheated, its rooms preserved like specimens in ice. Yet on this December morning, Leora found herself directed there by the housekeeper, armed with kindling and instructions to prepare the grand bedroom for use. His Grace has commanded it, Mrs. Holloway stated, her rheumy eyes widening with the significance of the order. 5 years that wing has stood empty, and now, without warning, she crossed herself quickly. Take care with the Duchess's possessions. Nothing is to be moved without explicit instruction. The key turned with reluctance in the long unused lock, the mechanism protesting like a creature woken from hibernation. Leora pushed against the heavy oak door, which yielded with a groan that echoed through vacant chambers. Hair stale and preserved, rushed past her as though escaping imprisonment. The Duchess's rooms told a story of abandoned glory. Furniture shrouded in holland covers stood like pale ghosts against damask walls. Crystal pendants on a neglected chandelier hung motionless, gathering dust instead of light. Upon the mantelpiece, a delicate porcelain clock had stopped at 4:30, preserving forever the moment when time had ceased to matter in these chambers. Leora moved toward the hearth, her footsteps muffled by carpets once vibrant, now dulled by years without care. A portrait hung above the fireplace, partially veiled by shadow. Even in the dim light, the subject's vivacity was evident. A woman with golden hair arranged in elaborate curls, her smile suggesting secrets shared with the viewer alone. The Duchess, captured in summer's full bloom, wearing the medallion that now rested against her widower's heart. The grate was cold and clean, as though prepared for a fire that had never been lit. Leora knelt before it, arranging kindling with practiced hands, her mind turning over the mystery of the Duke's sudden command. What had prompted him to open rooms so long sealed by grief? The kindling caught quickly, flames illuminating corners that had known only darkness for half a decade. As warmth spread through the chamber, something peculiar occurred. Scents long imprisoned began to release. Lavender sachets, beeswax polish, the ghost of perfume lingering in upholstery. The room seemed to exhale, surrendering its held breath. Leora moved to the windows, drawing back heavy curtains to admit pale winter light. Dust motes danced in sudden illumination, transforming the chamber from mausoleum to merely neglected space. Through leaded glass, she could see the Duke walking alone in the frost-stiffened gardens below, his dark figure stark against the white landscape. A gust of wind scattered dead leaves across the terrace. The Duke paused, lifting his face to the sky as though listening for something beyond human hearing. His hand rose to the medallion, a gesture Leora had come to recognize as preceding difficult decisions. He visits her grave each morning before sunrise, spoke a voice from the doorway. Leora turned to find Mrs. Holloway standing there, a bundle of linens in her arms. The housekeeper's expression had softened, age and memory momentarily overcoming station. The Duchess was summer itself, Mrs. Holloway continued, moving to place fresh sheets upon the bed. Laughed like music, she did. Brought flowers inside even in December. The staff called her Lady Sunshine when she couldn't hear. She smoothed the linen with gnarled fingers. His Grace was different then. Young. Smiled sometimes. Leora returned her attention to the fire, adding a log that cracked and sparked. What happened to her? The housekeeper hesitated. Loyalty warring with the human need to share sorrow long carried. Childbed fever, she answered finally. The babe came too early, neither survived the night. Her voice lowered to a whisper. His Grace was away when it happened. Some business in London. By the time he returned, she was already gone. The weight of understanding settled upon Leora, not just of death but of absence at the critical moment, of guilt that could freeze a heart more effectively than any winter. He blamed himself, she murmured, not a question but a recognition. Mrs. Holloway nodded slowly, ordered the fires extinguished in half the house the very next day, said if warmth could not save her, cold would preserve her memory. She straightened, remembering herself. Mind you don't speak of this below stairs. His Grace values discretion above all virtues. When the housekeeper had gone, Leora remained by the window, watching the solitary figure in the garden. The Duke had stopped beside a stone bench, partially buried in snow. From his pocket, he withdrew something small that caught the light. A key, perhaps, or a ring. Whatever it was, he studied it intently before returning it to the safety of his coat. As though sensing her gaze, he looked up suddenly, directly at the window where she stood. Leora stepped back instinctively, but not before their eyes met across the distance. For a heartbeat neither moved, servant and master, connected by the invisible thread of observation. Then, with deliberate purpose, the Duke inclined his head in the slightest of acknowledgments before turning toward the house. The fire behind her crackled, sending shadows dancing across the Duchess's portrait. In the new light, Leora noticed what had been obscured before. The woman's hands rested protectively over her middle, suggesting the portrait had been commissioned during her pregnancy. Joy and anticipation radiated from her painted face, unaware of the tragedy that awaited. Impulsively, Leora reached up and touched the frame, a gesture of solidarity with a woman she had never known. He remembers, she whispered to the portrait. He remembers everything. When the Duke entered the chamber minutes later, he found the fire burning steadily, the windows clear of condensation, and Leora arranging winter roses in a crystal vase, white blooms that somehow found life beneath the snow. He paused on the threshold, his expression unreadable. "You've brought flowers," he observed, his voice carefully neutral. Leora curtsied, uncertain if she had overstepped. "The gardener mentioned the Duchess favoured them, Your Grace." For a long moment, he stood motionless, gaze moving between the portrait, the roses, and the crackling hearth. Then, with precision that suggested effort, he removed the medallion from his neck and placed it upon the mantelpiece beneath his wife's image. "Leave me," he commanded softly. As Leora slipped from the room, she glimpsed his reflection in the mirror, the Duke of Helewin kneeling before the fire she had lit, his head bowed as though in prayer or confession to the warmth he had so long denied himself. A fortnight passed, each day marked by the lighting of fires throughout Whitmere Hall. Corridors long abandoned to shadow and chill gradually awakened, servants moving through them with increasing frequency as the Duke commanded more rooms be opened and warmed. The household observed these changes with cautious wonder, whispering behind raised hands that spring seemed to be arriving early within the manor's stone walls, if nowhere else. The morning sky pressed low and grey against leaded windows, promising snow before nightfall. Leora moved through the music room, lighting candles in wall sconces, their glow reflected in the polished surface of a grand pianoforte that had stood untouched for half a decade. She paused at the instrument, her fingers hovering above ivory keys that gleamed like teeth in the half-light. "Do you play, Miss Dane?" The Duke's voice emerged from the doorway, startling her. Leora turned, curtsying quickly. "No, Your Grace. I was merely curious," he finished for her, advancing into the room. Today he wore a waistcoat of midnight blue beneath his customary black coat, the subtle change in his attire noted and remarked upon below stairs. "Curiosity is a quality I have observed in you frequently." She felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I meant no impertinence. I did not suggest you did." He moved to the pianoforte, running his fingers lightly along its edge. "This instrument belonged to my wife. She played each evening after dinner, Mozart mostly, though occasionally something of her own composition." The admission surprised Leora. The Duke rarely spoke of the Duchess, as though her name itself were a spell that might conjure unbearable memory. She must have been very accomplished, Leora offered softly. She was life itself, he replied, the words emerging with unexpected rawness. His fingers paused upon a small carving at the corner of the instrument, two intertwined letters, E and I, surrounded by delicate roses. I had this commissioned for her birthday, our last together. Outside, the first snowflakes began their descent, thick and silent against the window glass. The room seemed suspended between seasons, the winter pressing from without, the memory of summer contained within. The Duke's hand moved to the medallion at his throat, then stopped, as though remembering he had left it in the Duchess's chamber. "Why have you not asked about her?" he inquired suddenly. Leora hesitated, uncertain of the question's intent. "It is not my place to inquire about such personal matters, Your Grace. And yet you have learned of her, have you not? The servants speak. They always do. They speak with respect," she assured him, then added more quietly, "with fondness." His eyes met hers, searching. "What else have they told you of Whitmere's history, of its master?" The question carried danger. Leora chose her words with care. "That Your Grace values order, that winters have been particularly observed since the Duchess's passing." "Particularly observed," he repeated, a hint of bitter amusement coloring his tone. "An elegant phrase for a house entombed in ice." He turned toward the window, his profile stark against the falling snow. "Do you know why I commanded the north wing be opened, Miss Dane?" "No, Your Grace." "Because on that morning in the library, you spoke of books as windows when doors remained closed." His voice remained level, as though stating a simple fact rather than a revelation. "It occurred to me that I had been living in a house of closed doors, self-imposed confinement." The admission hung between them, fragile as the snowflakes dissolving against the glass. "The fire in Her Grace's chamber," he continued. "You've maintained it daily?" "Yes, Your Grace, as instructed." "And the medallion I left upon the mantel?" "Untouched, Your Grace." He nodded once, seemingly satisfied. "Tonight, Lady Winters hosts several of the county families for dinner, a small gathering she has organized without my encouragement, but not without my consent." His lips curved slightly, though the expression could not properly be called a smile. "You will attend to the fires in the drawing room." Leora recognized the instruction for what it was, not merely a task, but an opportunity to observe the upper circles that normally remained closed to one of her station. "Yes, Your Grace." He moved toward the door, then paused, his gaze falling upon the pianoforte once more. "She would have approved of you, I think," he said quietly. "Isolde always believed that warmth should be shared, not hoarded." With those words he departed, leaving Leora alone in the music room, the first formal acknowledgement of the Duchess's name hanging in the air like a note from the silent instrument. The evening arrived wrapped in new-fallen snow and early darkness. Leora moved discreetly through the drawing-room, adding coal to the fire while footmen arranged candles in silver holders. The glow transformed Whitmere's formal chambers, lending warmth to rooms long accustomed to shadow. Crystal glasses caught the light, fracturing it into prisms across damask walls. Fresh hothouse flowers, imported at considerable expense, filled crystal vases, their perfume mingling with beeswax and the subtle scent of polished silver. From her position by the hearth, Leora observed Lady Winters directing final preparations, the older woman's face pinched with determination. This gathering, the first at Whitmere since the Duchess's death, represented more than social obligation. It was the reassertion of influence carefully timed to coincide with the Duke's gradual thawing. "The fire must not falter," Lady Winters instructed as she passed Leora. "His Grace has developed a sudden appreciation for warmth. We shall not disappoint him." The words carried double meaning like everything the woman uttered. Leora merely nodded, continuing her work with practiced efficiency. The guests arrived in carriages that cut dark paths through the fresh snow, wheels crunching on the gravel drive. Names were announced, greetings exchanged, society's carefully choreographed dance beginning anew at Whitmere after years of silence. Beneath the polite murmurs and cultivated laughter, Leora detected the true currency of the evening: curiosity. These people had come not merely to dine, but to witness the Duke of Halwyn's emergence from isolation. Lady Winters had arranged the gathering with strategic precision. Among the guests was Lady Caroline Blackwood, a widow of substantial fortune and impeccable lineage, seated beside the Duke at dinner. From her position near the drawing-room fire, Leora glimpsed the tableau through open doors, the handsome widow leaning slightly toward her host, her smile practiced and perfect. A promising match, do you not think? The words came from Mrs. Holloway, who had appeared silently beside Leora. The housekeeper's gaze followed the same sightline. Lady Winters has planned this for months. Her ladyship is determined that Whitmer should have a mistress again before another winter passes. Leora felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. His Grace does not seem overly engaged in the conversation. Men rarely recognize what benefits them until properly guided, Mrs. Holloway replied, with the wisdom of decades in service. The county will approve the match. Lady Caroline brings both fortune and connections. The dinner proceeded, courses appearing and being cleared with the precision of a military campaign. When the gentlemen remained for port and the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, Leora busied herself with the fire, keeping her eyes lowered as Lady Winters led the feminine contingent to the arranged chairs. "The transformation in His Grace is remarkable," observed one matron, settling her considerable frame into a delicate chair. "When last I saw him, at the Midsummer Assembly 2 years past, he spoke not a dozen words the entire evening." "Grief must run its course," Lady Winters replied smoothly. "Elias has at last recognized that life continues, that certain obligations must be fulfilled." Lady Caroline adjusted a bracelet of impressive diamonds. "He speaks little still, though what he says carries weight. There is something compelling in such restraint. My nephew requires proper guidance to fully rejoin society," Lady Winters continued. "A man alone too long forgets the civilizing influence of feminine companionship." The conversation shifted to other matters: local marriages, London fashions, the coming season. Leora remained by the fire, invisible to the assembled ladies despite her presence. The servant's gift of fading into background allowed her to observe unnoticed as Lady Winters skillfully directed conversation, weaving an invisible web with Lady Caroline at its centre. When the gentlemen joined them, Leora watched the Duke enter last, his expression carefully composed. His gaze swept the room, resting briefly on the fire, and by extension on her, before turning to his duties as host. The recognition was slight, merely a flickering awareness, yet it warmed her more thoroughly than the flames she tended. Lady Winters guided Lady Caroline to the pianoforte, insisting that the company would benefit from music. The widow demurred appropriately before acquiescing, her fingers moving across the keys with technical skill if little passion. The Duke stood beside the instrument, turning pages with mechanical precision, his face a study in polite attention. Yet when the performance concluded and polite applause faded, he did not move away. Instead, his fingers traced the carved initials in the corner of the instrument, the same intertwined E and I he had shown Leora that morning. "A lovely instrument," Lady Caroline observed. "Italian, is it not?" "Viennese," the Duke corrected quietly. "It was my wife's." The room's atmosphere shifted perceptibly, the Duchess's ghost suddenly present among them. Lady Winters' smile tightened, her fan opening with a sharp click. "My dear Elias," she interjected swiftly, "perhaps you might show Lord Blackwood your collection of astronomical instruments?" He expressed particular interest at dinner. The Duke's hand lingered on the carving a moment longer before he straightened, resuming the mask of proper host. "Of course, if you'll follow me, Blackwood." As he led several gentlemen from the room, his gaze again found Leora by the fire. This time the look carried unmistakable meaning, recognition of a shared understanding, of a confidence kept. The evening wound to its inevitable conclusion. Carriages were called, wraps fetched, goodbyes exchanged with promises of reciprocal invitations. Lady Winters glowed with triumph, having orchestrated precisely the reintroduction to society she had envisioned. Only once did her satisfaction falter, when Lady Caroline extended her hand to the Duke in farewell, and he bowed over it with correct form, but without the lingering touch that might have suggested particular regard. When the last guest had departed, Lady Winters turned to her nephew, her voice honeyed with approval. "You acquitted yourself admirably, Elias. Lady Caroline is most impressed. I would not be surprised if her thoughts turned to Whitmer's mistress-ship." The Duke removed his formal cravat with a single deft movement. "The pianoforte requires tuning," he replied, ignoring her insinuation entirely. "See that it is attended to before any further performances are attempted." Dismissed so completely, Lady Winters had no choice but to withdraw, though her expression promised future strategies. Left alone in the now silent drawing-room, the Duke approached the fire where Leora still knelt, adding a final log to sustain the warmth through the night. "Your assessment of the evening, Miss Dane?" he asked, his voice carrying a weariness he had not shown his guests. Leora rose, surprised by the question. "It is not my place to judge, Your Grace." Yet you observed, closely. He gestured toward the chair nearest the fire, an invitation that crossed boundaries of station and propriety. Speak freely. No ears but ours remain awake at this hour. Hesitantly, she perched on the edge of the offered seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The guest seemed pleased to be welcomed at Whitmere again. Diplomatic, he noted with faint amusement. Now your honest impression. Leora drew a careful breath. Lady Winters had specific aims for the gathering. The company was selected with particular care. Indeed, my aunt's subtlety rivals that of a cavalry charge. The Duke lowered himself into the opposing chair, firelight casting his features into sharp relief. And Lady Caroline, what did you make of our apparent paragon of widowhood? She plays with technical skill, Leora answered carefully. But without heart, he finished, surprising her with the echo of her own unspoken assessment. Yes, I thought the same. The log Leora had added settled deeper into the coals, sending a shower of sparks upward. Outside, snow continued to fall, insulating Whitmere in a blanket of white silence. When Isolde played, the Duke said softly, one heard summer in every note, even in December. His fingers moved unconsciously to where the medallion would have rested, finding nothing. The absence seemed to recall him to the present moment and the impropriety of their conversation. He stood abruptly. You have performed your duties admirably, Miss Dane. Whitmere has not been so well warmed in years. The dismissal was gentle but clear. Leora rose, curtsying before moving toward the servants' passage. At the threshold, his voice stopped her. Tomorrow, bring the medallion from my wife's chamber to the library at first light. The instruction was delivered in his usual precise tone, yet something in his expression suggested significance beyond the simple task. Yes, Your Grace, she replied, wondering at the request but knowing better than to question it. As she made her way through darkened corridors to the servants' quarters, Leora became aware of a curious sensation, as though something essential had shifted within Whitmere's walls. The Duke had welcomed guests, had spoken his wife's name aloud, had shared private thoughts with a maid who tended fires. Small changes, perhaps, like the first drops of water from melting icicles. Yet in a house long frozen by grief, even the smallest thaw suggested the possibility of spring. Dawn arrived beneath a sky heavy with renewed snowfall. Leora woke before the other maids, dressing quickly in the grey light that filtered through frosted windows. The servants' quarters, housed in Whitmere's attic story, offered no defense against winter's bite. Her breath clouded before her as she splashed cold water on her face, then pinned her hair beneath a simple cap. The medallion lay where the Duke had left it, resting on the mantelpiece in the Duchess's chamber. Leora wrapped it carefully in a square of clean linen before slipping it into her pocket. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, as though it carried more than mere gold. The library waited in half-darkness, tall windows admitting only the uncertain light of early morning. Leora busied herself with kindling, coaxing flames from cold ash, the familiar task calming her inexplicable nervousness. The medallion pressed against her hip through the fabric of her dress, a constant reminder of her unusual errand. You're prompt, observed the Duke from the doorway. He entered without sound, a skill she had noticed in him before, the ability to appear as suddenly as winter mist. Today he wore riding clothes, though the weather seemed prohibitive for such activity. The medallion, Your Grace. Leora removed it from her pocket, offering it with outstretched hand. He made no move to take it. Open it, he instructed instead, moving to stand beside the newly kindled fire. Leora hesitated, surprised by the command. Your Grace? Open it, he repeated, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. I wish to know what you see. With careful fingers, Leora found the hidden catch at the medallion's edge. It yielded with a soft click, revealing two compartments within the hinged casing. On one side lay a miniature portrait, the Duchess painted with delicate strokes that captured the vitality evident in her larger likeness. On the other side, pressed beneath glass, rested a curl of golden hair bound with blue silk thread. What do you see, Miss Dane? The Duke prompted when she remained silent. Her Grace, Leora answered softly, and a lock of her hair. Look closer at the portrait, at the background. Leora obeyed, examining the miniature with greater attention. Behind the Duchess's radiant face stretched a summer landscape, a garden in full bloom, with a particular rose bush bearing white blossoms dominating the foreground. Roses, she observed, white ones like those the gardener cultivates in the glasshouse. Winter roses, the Duke confirmed. They bloom when all else surrenders to frost. Isolde loved them beyond reason. He turned from the fire to face her directly. "I have spent 5 years living in December, Miss Dane." Frozen at the moment of her passing, preserving grief as though it were her legacy rather than a perversion of all she valued. The admission, delivered in his customary measured tone, carried the weight of confession. Leora remained still, intuiting that any movement might stem the unexpected flow of confidences. "Yesterday you spoke of her with simple truth, that she valued warmth, that she would have approved of its return to Whitmere." His gaze held hers steadily. "I would know how a maid who never met my wife could understand what those who knew her seemed determined to forget." Leora looked down at the medallion in her palm, gathering courage. "I have observed how the household speaks of her, Your Grace, not with the formal reverence Lady Winters employs, but with genuine fondness. Mrs. Holloway called her Lady Sunshine." She hesitated before adding, "And I have seen how you touch this medallion when confronted with decisions, as though seeking counsel from her memory, rather than merely honoring it." Surprise flickered briefly across his features, quickly masked. "You are unusually perceptive for a servant," she finished, then immediately regretted the interruption. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I spoke without thinking." "For anyone," he corrected mildly. "Perception is rarely cultivated regardless of station." He extended his hand, and she placed the medallion in his open palm. Their fingers brushed momentarily, a contact brief, yet startling in its impropriety. The Duke closed the medallion with practiced ease, but did not return it to its customary place around his neck. Instead, he placed it upon the desk, where a leather-bound journal lay open beside an uncapped ink pot. "I ride to the Northfield tenancies this morning," he announced, changing course with the abruptness she had come to recognize as characteristic. "There is a matter of rents in arrears that requires personal attention rather than legal enforcement." Understanding dawned on Leora's face. "You intend mercy for the tenants." "I intend justice tempered by circumstance," he corrected, though without heat. "Winter has been unusually severe. A landlord who demands what cannot be paid serves neither his tenants nor his own interests." He moved toward the door, then paused. "The roses in the glasshouse see that a fresh arrangement is placed in the Duchess's chamber." "Yes, Your Grace." He nodded once, seemingly satisfied, then departed with the same silent grace that had marked his arrival. Leora remained by the fire, her gaze drawn to the medallion upon the desk. Beside it lay the Duke's journal, its pages covered in precise handwriting. Though she would never have presumed to read its contents, a single line caught her eye, the last entry, written in fresh ink. "Perhaps winter, too, serves a purpose I had not considered." Snow continued to fall beyond the library windows, yet somehow its quality seemed altered, less a barrier than a blanket, less an ending than a necessary pause before renewal. Leora added another log to the fire, watching as it caught and flared. In that moment she understood with sudden clarity that she had been granted not merely tasks, but trust, a commodity far more precious within Whitmere's walls than the gold of the medallion or the ancient volumes that lined the shelves around her. Outside, a lone figure on horseback emerged from the stables, the Duke's dark form a stark silhouette against the white landscape. He paused, looking back at the house, at the library window where she stood, before urging his mount forward into the falling snow. The blizzard descended without warning, transforming gentle snowfall into a howling fury that erased boundaries between earth and sky. By midday, Whitmere Hall stood isolated within a world rendered featureless and white. Windows rattled beneath wind's assault. Chimneys moaned with each fierce gust. Servants hurried through corridors, lighting additional lamps against the unnatural darkness that accompanied the storm. In the kitchen, Mrs. Holloway directed emergency preparations with the efficiency of a general commanding troops. "Nothing will move on the roads today," she declared, checking stores of candles and lamp oil, "nor likely tomorrow. His Grace is caught out in this. Heaven help him." Leora paused in her task of filling coal scuttles. "The Duke has not returned. Rode out at dawn, did he not? To the Northfield tenancies." The housekeeper shook her head gravely. "No man could find his way home in this devil's brew, not even one who knows these lands as he does." Anxiety tightened around Leora's chest. "Perhaps he sought shelter with the tenants when the weather turned." "Perhaps," Mrs. Holloway agreed, though her tone suggested limited confidence. "Pray he did. A man can freeze within minutes in such conditions." Lady Winters swept into the kitchen, her presence there a testament to the situation's gravity. "Has there been any word from my nephew?" "None, my lady," Mrs. Holloway confirmed. The grooms have lit the stable lantern high, but visibility extends barely beyond the courtyard gates. Foolishness, Lady Winters pronounced, her fan snapping open despite the chill. To ride out with snow already falling. Elias knows better. His Grace felt the matter urgent, Leora found herself saying. All eyes turned to her, surprise evident in their expressions. The tenant's rents, she added softly. He mentioned the purpose before departing. Lady Winters regarded her with narrowed eyes. And how would you be privy to his Grace's intentions, girl? Leora cursed her impulsive tongue. I was tending the library fire when he departed, my lady. Indeed. The single word carried volumes of suspicion. Lady Winters turned back to Mrs. Holloway, dismissing Leora with the gesture. Have fires maintained in all main chambers. His Grace will require warmth when, if, he returns. As the day progressed, the storm intensified rather than abating. Darkness fell early, indistinguishable from the grey gloom that had persisted since noon. Servants gathered in the kitchen between duties, exchanging worried glances as the hours passed with no sign of the Duke. Leora moved through her tasks with mechanical precision, tending fires throughout the house, while her thoughts remained fixed on the lone rider somewhere in the white wilderness. She remembered his expression that morning, the quiet resolve, the medallion left behind, the journal entry half glimpsed, small details that now seemed portentous. When the grandfather clock in the hall struck 9, Lady Winters finally gave voice to what many had privately feared. We must consider the possibility that His Grace has perished in the storm. The pronouncement, delivered in the drawing-room, where family and senior servants had gathered to await news, fell into shocked silence. Surely it is premature to abandon hope, protested Mr. Kenilworth, the estate manager, who had arrived just before the worst of the storm descended. Hope is the luxury of summer, Mr. Kenilworth, Lady Winters replied grimly. Winter demands practicality. No man could survive hours in this tempest without shelter. The tenant cottages, Leora suggested, unable to remain silent despite propriety's demands. His Grace may have reached them before. Mind your place, girl, Lady Winters snapped. Your duties do not include speculation on matters beyond your understanding. Mrs. Holloway intervened diplomatically. Miss Dane, perhaps you might check the fires in His Grace's chambers. Ensure all is prepared should he return. The instruction offered escape from Lady Winters' censure and an opportunity for privacy. Leora accepted it gratefully, slipping from the drawing-room with a brief curtsy. The Duke's personal chambers occupied the east wing, their windows facing the direction from which he would return, if return he did. Leora tended the fire in his bedchamber, adding logs until the blaze cast a warm glow throughout the austere room. Unlike the Duchess's quarters, these chambers bore little evidence of personality. No portraits adorned the walls. No personal objects cluttered the surfaces. Only a single bookshelf, filled with astronomical texts and navigational treatises, suggested individual taste. Moving to the window, Leora pressed her forehead against cold glass, straining to see beyond the curtain of white. The stable lantern burned in the distance, its light diffused into a ghostly glow by the driving snow. Nothing moved in the space between. He will return, she whispered to herself, the words forming frost patterns on the pane. He must. As though in answer to her unvoiced prayer, the distant sound of hoofbeats penetrated the storm's howl. Leora held her breath, uncertain if her mind had conjured the noise from desperate hope. Then came a shout, faint but unmistakable, and the sudden flurry of movement in the stable-yard below. She ran from the chamber without thought, propriety forgotten in the surge of relief. Servants poured from every doorway as word spread through the house. By the time Leora reached the entrance hall, the heavy oak door stood open, admitting both the fury of the storm and the subject of their collective worry. The Duke of Halewyn leaned heavily against Mr. Kenilworth, his greatcoat encrusted with ice, his face deathly pale beneath windburn. Snow fell from his garments with each laboured step, melting on the marble floor into spreading pools. "Nephew!" Lady Winters rushed forward, her earlier pragmatism dissolved in evident relief. We had begun to fear the worst. The Duke's gaze swept the gathered household, settling briefly on Leora before he straightened with visible effort. I apologize for the alarm. The storm proved more challenging than anticipated. You require immediate warmth, Lady Winters declared. Mrs. Holloway, hot bricks for His Grace's bed. And brandy. At once. No. The single word emerged with surprising strength. I shall take a bath and change these frozen clothes. Nothing more is required. As servants hurried to fulfill the revised instructions, Leora found herself fixed by the Duke's steady gaze. Miss Dane, he addressed her directly, ignoring the startled expressions this familiarity produced. Attend to the fire in my dressing room. I shall require additional warmth. The command, delivered in his usual measured tone, nevertheless contained an unmistakable message. He wished to speak with her privately. Lady Winter's expression tightened with displeasure, but even she dared not countermand a direct order from Whitmer's master. Leora curtsied, moving quickly toward the east wing to prepare as instructed. Behind her she heard Lady Winter's voice, pitched low, but carrying in the stone hallway. Really, Elias, such familiarity with the staff is most irregular. The girl is becoming quite above herself. The Duke's reply was too quiet to discern, but something in his tone silenced further protest. By the time Leora reached his dressing room, her hands trembled with more than cold. To be singled out so publicly, to be the subject of Lady Winter's displeasure, these developments boded ill for her position at Whitmere, regardless of the Duke's apparent favor. She knelt before the hearth, building the fire higher, focusing on the familiar task to steady her nerves. Footmen arrived carrying heated water for the copper bath that stood behind a Japanese screen in the corner. They worked efficiently, filling the tub before departing with murmured acknowledgments of her presence, though their curious glances conveyed unspoken questions about her unorthodox assignment. When all was prepared, Leora moved to leave, unwilling to be found alone in the Duke's private chambers when he arrived. As her hand touched the doorknob, it turned from the other side. The Duke entered, already divested of his frozen greatcoat, though his remaining garments showed damp evidence of melting snow. "Your Grace," she curtsied, stepping back to allow him passage. "The bath is prepared. I shall leave you to stay." The command was gentle but firm. When she hesitated, he added, "Please." Propriety warred with the undeniable authority in his voice. Leora compromised by standing near the door, her gaze fixed modestly on the carpet, while the Duke moved to the fire. "I reached the Northfield tenancy," he said after a moment of silence. "The Williams family has endured particular hardship this winter. Their youngest child lies ill with lung fever." Leora raised her eyes, surprised by this confidence. "I am sorry to hear it, Your Grace. I remained longer than intended, ensuring the physician I had summoned arrived safely." He removed his gloves, holding pale hands toward the flames. By then, the storm had intensified beyond all expectation. Understanding dawned on Leora's face. "You risked yourself for the tenant's child." "I did what any landlord should," he countered, though without conviction. "The point is that I very nearly did not return at all. The path disappeared within minutes. My horse lost footing in a drift." His voice remained steady, but something in his expression revealed the true danger he had faced. "I thought of Isolde then, of how she died while I was absent." The confession hung in the space between them, weighted with significance beyond the mere recounting of events. Leora remained silent, instinctively recognizing that interruption would stem the unusual flow of confidence. "5 years I have preserved her memory in ice," he continued, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Today, trapped in the very winter I had cultivated within these walls, I realized the profound selfishness of my grief. In the days that followed his near-fatal journey through the blizzard, the Duke of Halowin's transformation became impossible to ignore. The household observed with quiet wonder as Whitmere Hall continued its awakening from half a decade of frozen slumber. Rooms long closed were opened to light and air. Portraits previously shrouded emerged to reclaim their places on ancient walls. The Duke himself moved through these spaces with an altered presence, still reserved, still dignified, yet somehow unburdened, as though having shed an invisible weight. On a clear February morning, when sunshine transformed the snow-covered gardens into a landscape of diamonds, Leora discovered a curious summons waiting for her, a note delivered by Mrs. Holloway, requesting her presence in the Duchess's chamber at 11 o'clock. The instruction, written in the Duke's precise hand, offered no explanation for this unprecedented command. "His Grace has developed unusual habits of late," Mrs. Holloway observed, watching Leora's expression as she read the message. "Lady Winters believes London society might restore proper perspective. She speaks of a season in town." Leora carefully folded the note, concealing the involuntary tightening in her chest at this intelligence. "His Grace seems content at Whitmere now that more rooms are opened." "Men of his station require more than contentment," the housekeeper replied with practiced wisdom. "They require suitable companionship and heirs. Lady Caroline continues to correspond regularly." The prospect of the Duke departing for London, and the implied possibility of his return with a bride, should have meant nothing to a servant whose position depended on his household's continuation. Yet Leora found herself unable to dismiss a sharp sense of loss at the thought. In the week since the blizzard, their interactions had maintained formal boundaries of master and servant, yet beneath this propriety flowed an undercurrent of understanding, a shared secret language of glances and half-smiles that acknowledged their peculiar connection. At precisely 11 o'clock, Leora presented herself at the Duchess's chamber, knocking softly on the carved oak door. The Duke's voice bade her enter. She found him standing by the window, winter sunlight illuminating his profile, the medallion once again suspended from a chain around his neck. "Miss Dane," he acknowledged, turning to face her. "Thank you for your promptness." "Your Grace," she curtsied, keeping her eyes modestly lowered, though acutely aware of his steady gaze. "I have a matter of some delicacy to discuss," he began, gesturing toward the small writing desk where a leather portfolio lay open. "Regarding my late wife." Leora remained near the door, uncertain of her role in this private domain. "I am at your service, Your Grace. 5 years ago, when Isolde died, I ordered many of her personal effects sealed away, not merely her clothing and jewelry, but her correspondence, her diaries, her music." He touched the medallion absently. "I thought preservation equated to honor. I was wrong." He moved to the desk, lifting a leather-bound volume from within the portfolio. "This journal contains her thoughts during our marriage, including the months before her confinement. I have read only the first pages, finding myself—" He paused, searching for the correct term, unprepared for the intimacy of her voice across time. Leora struggled to understand why the Duke shared this information. "Your Grace, surely such private memories are best honored through living remembrance rather than frozen preservation," he completed, "which brings me to my request." He extended the journal toward her. "I wish you to read certain passages aloud." The request startled her into raising her eyes to his. "Your Grace, I could not presume. It is precisely because you did not know her that I ask this of you," he explained, his voice gentle but resolute. "You will read her words without the weight of personal memory. You will give voice to Isolde as she was, not as grief has painted her in my mind." The journal remained extended between them, its leather binding worn smooth by hands now 5 years still. Leora recognized the profound trust inherent in the request, not merely to handle the Duchess's private thoughts, but to serve as medium between husband and wife across death's divide. With careful reverence, she accepted the volume. "If you are certain this is what you wish." "I am." He moved to stand by the fireplace, his back half turned as though to grant both himself and her a measure of privacy in this intimate act. The ribbon marks the passage. Leora opened the journal where a blue silk ribbon, the same shade as that which bound the lock of hair in the medallion, separated the pages. The handwriting that filled them danced across the paper, fluid and expressive, the very opposite of the Duke's precise script. Taking a steadying breath, she began to read. April 12, 1845. "Elias rode out early this morning to inspect the north fields. I watched from our bedroom window as he departed, thinking how different he appears on horseback, unleashed somehow, free from the careful restraint he maintains in society. I often wonder if others see this quality in him, this capacity for joy that he guards so carefully behind proper manners. Perhaps it is my greatest privilege as his wife to witness these moments when duty falls away and his true spirit emerges. The physician confirmed my suspicions yesterday. A child grows within me. I have not yet told Elias, wishing to choose the perfect moment for such news. How strange that something so small can already inspire such fierce protection in my heart. I find myself imagining our child's future. Will he have his father's thoughtful gaze, or perhaps inherit my impatience with propriety? Will she love music as I do, or prefer Elias's beloved astronomy? I have begun composing a lullaby, simple notes that come to me in half-sleep. I hum them while walking in the garden, particularly among the winter roses that now bloom in earnest. These flowers that defy the season's expectations seem a perfect symbol for the life we have created together, warmth that persists despite cold surroundings. I pray for a mild winter next year when our child will be among us. Elias laughs at my concerns about drafts and chills, assuring me that Whitmere has withstood centuries of Yorkshire winters. Still, I have instructed the gardener to increase the winter rose plantings. Their blooms shall be my reminder that beauty persists even in the harshest season. Leora's voice faltered as the entry concluded. She looked up to find the Duke motionless before the fire, his shoulders rigid with controlled emotion. "There is another passage," he said after a moment, his voice roughened. "Some weeks later, the blue ribbon." Turning pages carefully, Leora found the second marked section. The handwriting here appeared more hurried, as though capturing thoughts that arrived too quickly for proper penmanship. June 18th, 1845. How quickly joy transforms to anxiety. The physician has ordered bed rest following yesterday's alarming symptoms. Elias hovers like a shadow, convinced that my condition is somehow his doing. I cannot bear his self-recrimination, as though love could ever be a fault. I have made him promise to depart for London tomorrow as planned. The estate business cannot wait, and his presence here only adds to my determination to appear stronger than I feel. Mrs. Holloway will attend me faithfully. The household runs with perfect efficiency under her direction. Before retiring tonight, Elias brought the medallion he had commissioned for my birthday, though that celebration remains weeks away. Inside, he has placed a miniature portrait and a lock of my hair. To keep me close while we are parted, he explained. The gesture nearly undid my resolve to send him to London. How fortunate I am in my husband, who understands that love means both holding close and setting free when necessary. The winter roses bloom unseasonably early this year. I have ordered some cut for my bedside table, their scent a constant companion. When our child arrives in December, these same blooms shall decorate the nursery. There is wisdom in flowers that thrive when all else retreats. A lesson in persistence I shall teach our little one from the earliest days. Silence filled the chamber as the Duchess's voice, channeled through Leora, faded into the winter light. The Duke remained motionless for several heartbeats before turning to face her. His expression contained no trace of the icy reserve that had defined him when she first entered Whitmer's service. In its place, a raw vulnerability that transformed his countenance entirely. "She sent me away," he said quietly. Her final act of love was to insist I attend to business rather than remain at her side. When the message reached me in London 3 days later, she was already gone. Leora closed the journal with gentle hands. She trusted you would understand her choice. Instead, I retreated into frozen grief for 5 years. Bitterness edged his tone. I allowed winter to claim not merely my heart, but every corner of the home we had created together. "Your Grace," "Elias," he interrupted, the informality startling them both. "My name is Elias. After sharing Isolde's most intimate thoughts, surely such formality seems absurd. The boundary thus crossed could never be restored." Leora hesitated, balance shifting beneath her feet like ice beginning to crack. "I cannot address you so, Your Grace. My position," "Your position," he echoed with sudden intensity, "is unique in this household. You alone have seen both Isolde, as she truly was, and the man I have become in her absence." He moved toward her with deliberate steps. "You alone recognize that warmth, not cold, honors her memory." The space between them narrowed, propriety's invisible walls thinning with each word. Leora clutched the journal like a shield, aware of dangerous currents beneath this conversation. "Lady Winters speaks of London," she said quietly, "of a season in town. My aunt speaks of many things, most of which I have learned to disregard." His lips curved slightly. "Though in this instance, she may have unwittingly suggested a course I find increasingly necessary." "Lady Caroline would make a suitable duchess," Leora offered, the words emerging despite the hollow ache they created. "The county already speaks of the match as though arranged." "The county," he replied with unexpected warmth, "like my aunt, speaks of matters beyond its knowledge." His fingers rose to touch the medallion at his throat. "Isolde chose me not for title or fortune, but for the man she perceived beneath society's expectations. She valued authenticity above all virtues." Sunlight shifted through the windows, casting the room in golden illumination that belied February's chill. Outside, icicles began to melt against the glass, water droplets catching light like suspended diamonds. "I must return this to you," Leora said, extending the journal with both hands. "It belongs among her treasures." As the Duke accepted the volume, his fingers brushed hers, a contact brief yet electric in its impropriety. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving voice to what I could not yet bear to hear alone." The moment stretched between them, fragile as new ice. Then, with evident effort, the Duke stepped back, propriety's boundaries reasserting themselves in the increased distance. "You may go, Miss Dane." His voice resumed its customary formality, though something in his expression remained altered, like landscape revealed when snow begins to melt. "The winter roses in the glass house. I shall see that fresh ones are brought for her Grace's chamber," she completed, understanding without explanation. He nodded once, the gesture both acknowledgement and dismissal. As Leora moved toward the door, his voice stopped her once more. "The journal entries you read," he said quietly. "They were the last she wrote before." He did not complete the sentence. "I wish to hear how she spoke of happiness, not merely remember how it ended." "She spoke of persistence, Your Grace," Leora answered, her hand upon the doorknob, "of beauty that thrives when all else retreats." Their eyes met across the sun-dappled room, master and servant, yet in that moment, simply man and woman joined by understanding that transcended station. Then Leora slipped through the door, closing it softly behind her. In the corridor beyond, she pressed her palm against her heart, feeling its quickened rhythm beneath her simple dress. Something had shifted within Whitmere's walls, something as profound and inevitable as winter yielding to spring's first warming breath. March arrived at Whitmere with unusual mildness, winds from the south carrying scents of distant thaw. The great drifts that had sealed the estate from the world began to diminish, revealing stone walls and hedgerows, long concealed beneath winter's blanket. In the gardens, green shoots ventured tentatively from softening soil, crocuses and snowdrops, the brave vanguard of spring's advancing army. Within the hall, change continued its steady progress. Curtains that had remained drawn for half a decade now admitted daylight into forgotten corners. Furniture emerged from Holland covers. Silver returned from storage to adorn tables long left bare. The pianoforte in the music room had been tuned, its voice restored after years of silence. Most remarkable of all was the transformation in the Duke himself. The household observed with cautious optimism as he engaged with estate matters long delegated to solicitors and managers. Tenants reported seeing him ride the boundaries, stopping to speak directly with farmers about their concerns. In the evenings, he sometimes lingered in the music room, his fingers moving hesitantly over keys that had known only his wife's touch for so many years. For Leora, these changes brought both joy and a peculiar sorrow. Joy to witness Whitmere's renewal, sorrow in the knowledge that this awakening would inevitably lead beyond the frozen pause that had, paradoxically, created the unusual closeness between herself and its master. Lady Winters had indeed prevailed in her campaign for a London season. Preparations for the Duke's departure progressed with relentless efficiency. Trunks retrieved from attics, formal attire inspected and refreshed, correspondence dispatched to open the Halloween townhouse closed since before the Duchess's death. "His Grace departs on Monday next," Mrs. Holloway informed the staff gathered for morning instructions. "Lady Winters accompanies him, of course. The household will operate on reduced status until their return after Easter." The news, though long expected, struck Leora with physical force. 1 week remained before the Duke would depart for a world where winter roses did not bloom and firemaids did not read Duchess's journals aloud in sun-filled chambers. That same afternoon, she was summoned to the library, a command delivered by the butler himself, his expression suggesting the unusual nature of the request. Leora followed him through corridors now bathed in spring light, her thoughts tumbling like meltwater over rocks. She found the Duke seated at his desk, papers arranged in precise stacks before him. The medallion gleamed against the dark fabric of his waistcoat, a constant presence since the day she had read Isolde's journal. "Miss Dane," he acknowledged, as the butler departed, closing the door with a soft click that sealed them in private conference. "Please sit." The invitation, for it was phrased as request rather than command, startled her. Servants did not sit in their master's presence unless specifically engaged in tasks requiring it, yet something in his expression brooked no refusal. Leora perched at the edge of the indicated chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I depart for London on Monday," he began without preamble. "Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Holloway has informed the staff. My aunt believes a season in town necessary for Whitmere's future." His fingers absently touched the medallion, that unconscious gesture she had come to recognize as preceding difficult subjects. "She has compiled a list of suitable candidates for the position of Duchess." Though Leora had prepared herself for this conversation, the words still landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through her carefully maintained composure. "The staff wishes Your Grace success in this endeavor," she replied, the formal phrase emerging with effort. "Do they?" A hint of amusement colored his tone. "And what does Leora Dane wish?" The use of her full name, so intimate, so inappropriate, brought her eyes to his in startled response. "It is not my place to hold wishes regarding Your Grace's personal matters." "Yet you do," he pressed gently, "as I hold wishes regarding yours." Confusion furrowed her brow. "Mine, Your Grace. I have observed your situation these past months," he continued, rising from the desk to stand before the window. Spring sunshine illuminated his profile, softening the austere lines of his face. A young woman of unusual perception and capability, consigned to tending fires when her mind clearly burns with greater ambition. Understanding dawned slowly. Your Grace intends to offer advancement within the household, perhaps as lady's maid when— She could not complete the sentence, could not speak aloud the reality of a new duchess at Whitmere. I intend nothing of the sort. He turned from the window to face her directly. I have instead arranged a different position entirely. In London. The pronouncement hung between them, incomprehensible at first hearing. London? She echoed. Companion secretary to the Dowager Countess of Merewether, my mother's closest friend and a woman of considerable influence. She requires an educated young woman to assist with correspondence, reading and household accounts. He lifted a letter from his desk. I have taken the liberty of recommending you for the position. The Countess has accepted my endorsement without question. Leora stared at him, unable to fully grasp the implications. You wish me to leave Whitmere? I wish, he replied carefully, to provide you opportunity commensurate with your abilities. Something flickered beneath his composed expression, an emotion quickly masked. The position offers respectable status, adequate compensation, and potential for future advancement. The world seemed to tilt beneath her, familiar ground suddenly unstable. I do not understand, Your Grace. Have I given cause for dissatisfaction? Quite the contrary. His voice gentled. You have demonstrated qualities I had forgotten existed in the world. Kindness without calculation, perception without judgment. He hesitated, then added more softly, warmth without demand. The compliments, delivered with such evident sincerity, only deepened her confusion. Then why? Because Whitmere stands at a crossroads, he interrupted, his tone resuming its customary precision. The future demands certain obligations be met, certain expectations fulfilled. Lady Winters, for all her calculating nature, is not wrong about the necessity of securing succession. Understanding crashed upon Leora with the force of spring floodwaters. The Duke sought to remove her from Whitmere before bringing home a bride, eliminating complications before they could arise. The knowledge burned with peculiar pain, though she recognized its perfect logic. The position with the Countess is, of course, entirely your choice, he continued, returning to his desk with measured steps. Should you prefer to remain at Whitmere, your place here is assured for as long as you wish it. Leora forced her voice to steadiness. When would the Countess require my presence? She winters in Bath until month's end. You would travel with her household to London for the season. He shuffled papers with uncharacteristic restlessness. I would escort you personally to her residence before attending to my own arrangements in town. The offer represented unimaginable opportunity, advancement beyond what a firemaid could reasonably hope to achieve in a lifetime of service. Yet beneath its generosity lay unmistakable message. Distance was required between them, propriety's boundaries reinforced by physical separation. It is most kind of your Grace to consider my future so thoughtfully, she managed at last. Kindness plays no role in this decision, he corrected, though gently. Merit alone recommends you. After a moment's hesitation, he added, though I shall miss our conversations. The simple admission, delivered without artifice, threatened to unravel her composure entirely. Leora rose, needing movement to master emotion. I am grateful for the opportunity, Your Grace, and for your confidence in my abilities. She clasped her hands to still their trembling. I shall inform Mrs. Holloway of my departure. He nodded once, the gesture simultaneously granting permission and acknowledging the conversation's conclusion. The carriage will be prepared for Monday morning. We depart at first light. Yes, Your Grace. She curtsied, moving toward the door with careful dignity despite the storm of feeling that raged within. His voice stopped her at the threshold. Miss Dane. She turned, finding him standing beside the desk, medallion gleaming in the afternoon light. Isolde would have approved of you, he said simply, of your courage in embracing change. The words formed a benediction of sorts, acknowledgement of bonds that could neither be pursued nor denied. Leora inclined her head in silent recognition before slipping through the door, leaving the Duke alone amid the lengthening shadows of afternoon. In the corridor beyond, reality settled upon her shoulders like a physical weight. In 3 days' time, she would leave Whitmere Hall, the place where she had discovered unexpected purpose and connection. The Duke would remain in London through the season, likely returning with a bride suited to his station. Life would proceed as propriety demanded. The brief thaw between master and servant, preserved only in memory, like flowers pressed between pages of a journal. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle spring showers rather than winter's icy assault. The sound pattered against leaded glass, nature's reminder that seasons change regardless of human desire to preserve particular moments in time. Leora touched the simple ribbon at her throat, her mother's last gift, carried like a talisman through years of service. "Courage," she whispered to herself, echoing the Duke's words. Courage in embracing change. The morning of departure dawned clear and cold, frost glittering across the lawns like scattered diamonds. Leora stood in the servants' hall, her few possessions packed in a single trunk already loaded onto the Duke's travelling carriage. Mrs. Holloway fussed over her appearance, adjusting the collar of the new travelling dress, a parting gift from the household, commissioned with surprising speed from the village seamstress. "Mind you write regular," the housekeeper instructed, her brisk tone belying the moisture in her eyes. "A countess's household is grand opportunity, but London has ways of turning a sensible head." "I shall remember where I began," Leora promised, embracing the older woman who had shown her consistent kindness during her time at Whitmere. The staff gathered to bid farewell, their faces reflecting genuine regret at her departure. Even Lady Winters acknowledged her with a curt nod as she passed through the entrance hall where the household assembled to see the travellers off. Outside, the Duke's carriage waited, its polished surface gleaming in the early light. 4 matched greys stamped impatiently against the gravel, their breath forming clouds in the morning air. The Duke himself stood beside the open door, his greatcoat lending additional breadth to his tall figure. "Miss Dane," he greeted her formally, though something in his gaze spoke of less restrained emotion. "Are you prepared for the journey?" "Yes, Your Grace," she curtsied, conscious of Lady Winters's sharp observation from the doorway. "Then we shall depart. The roads to York remain partially affected by winter's damage. I wish to reach the city before nightfall." With practiced courtesy, he assisted her into the carriage, a brief touch of gloved hands that, despite its propriety, sent warmth coursing through her veins. Lady Winters followed, settling herself across from Leora, with evident disapproval of the seating arrangement. The Duke entered last, taking his place beside his aunt rather than opposite, a choice that spoke volumes of his awareness regarding appearances. As the carriage pulled away from Whitmere Hall, Leora gazed back at the great house, memorizing its aspect in morning light. Stone walls that had seemed so forbidding upon her arrival now appeared almost golden, windows reflecting the risen sun like welcoming beacons. In just a few months the frozen estate had transformed, or perhaps, she reflected, the change existed primarily in her own perception. The journey proceeded in relative silence, Lady Winters occasionally offering observations about acquaintances they would encounter in London, the Duke responding with monosyllabic acknowledgements. Leora kept her attention fixed on the passing landscape, watching as snow-covered fields gradually gave way to the first tentative signs of spring, willow branches tinged with green, early lambs tottering beside watchful ewes. At midday, they stopped at a coaching inn for refreshment. Lady Winters dispatched a letter to London, while the Duke conferred with his coachman about the condition of the road ahead. Finding herself momentarily alone in the private parlour secured for their use, Leora approached the window, watching a pair of sparrows construct a nest beneath the eaves. "They build earlier this year," observed the Duke from the doorway, another sign of winter's early retreat. Leora turned, curtsying automatically despite the absence of other witnesses. "The countryside appears eager for spring, Your Grace." "As are we all, I think." He advanced into the room, removing his gloves with deliberate precision. "My aunt has discovered an acquaintance also travelling to York. She has accepted their invitation to continue the journey in their company." Understanding dawned on Leora's face. "We are to continue alone. With my valet and your maid following in the second carriage, yes." His expression remained carefully neutral. "Society would raise eyebrows, but as you travel under my protection to the Countess's household, appearances are adequately preserved." The arrangement walked the knife edge of propriety. A duke and a former servant travelling together, even with attendants following, would certainly inspire gossip in higher circles. Yet Leora recognized the opportunity it presented, a final chance for conversation unconstrained by Lady Winter's vigilant presence. "As your Grace thinks best," she replied, her tone revealing nothing of her inner tumult. When they resumed their journey an hour later, the altered seating arrangement created both physical and psychological space, unlike any they had shared before. Leora found herself seated opposite the Duke in the luxurious carriage, the empty space beside her emphasizing their isolation. For several miles, silence stretched between them, broken only by the rhythmic sound of hooves and the occasional creak of well-sprung wheels. The Duke appeared lost in thought, his gaze directed at the passing landscape without appearing to register its features. "You remain certain of your decision?" he asked finally, his attention returning to the carriage's interior. "To accept the Countess's position?" "Yes, Your Grace," she answered, though with less conviction than intended. "It represents opportunity I could not have imagined. Yet you do not seem entirely pleased by the prospect." His perception, as always, cut through pretense. Leora considered her response carefully. This journey marked their final private interaction. Truth, at last, seemed the only appropriate offering. "I have found unexpected purpose at Whitmere," she admitted, "in bringing warmth to rooms long cold, in witnessing the house's awakening." She hesitated, then added more softly, "in serving its master through difficult transformation." Something flickered across the Duke's features, an emotion she could not immediately identify. "You speak of Whitmere as though it were a living entity capable of feeling. Is it not?" she countered gently. "Great houses absorb the emotions of those who inhabit them. Whitmere has known grief and isolation. Now it begins to remember joy, thanks largely to your influence." His acknowledgement, delivered without artifice, caused warmth to bloom in her chest, despite the certainty of imminent separation. "Your Grace gives me too much credit. The change began within yourself." Outside, the landscape continued its gradual transformation. Winter's grip visibly loosening with each mile traveled southward. The carriage rounded a bend, revealing a village nestled in a valley below, church spire catching afternoon light like a beacon. "I have written to my solicitor," the Duke said after another stretch of companionable silence. "The Williams family, the tenants whose child fell ill during the blizzard, are to receive reduction in their rent for the coming year. Additionally, their son will be afforded education at my expense when he reaches suitable age." The information, shared without preamble, suggested its importance to the speaker. "That is most generous, Your Grace. It is not generosity but responsibility," he corrected mildly. Isolde always maintained that privilege confers obligation rather than merely granting license. His fingers touched the medallion, that habitual gesture that had become so familiar to her. I have remembered her words, if not always honored their meaning. Shadows lengthened across the road as afternoon waned toward evening. The carriage lamps were lit, casting a warm glow within the confined space. In this illumination, the Duke's features appeared softer, the austere lines of his face mellowed by golden light. "I never properly thanked you," he said unexpectedly. "Your Grace has been most generous in arranging my position with the Countess." "I speak not of that." His gaze held hers with unusual directness. "I refer to the fire you lit in a house that had forgotten warmth, to your courage in breaking through ice that had formed around more than merely rooms." The words hung between them, laden with meaning beyond their simple construction. Leora found herself unable to look away from his face, from the genuine emotion evident there. "I merely performed my duties, Your Grace." "Elias," he corrected softly. "For this one journey between the life that was and the life that will be, perhaps we might set aside formalities." The invitation crossed boundaries more significant than mere address. Yet in the liminality of travel, suspended between departure and arrival, usual constraints seemed temporarily altered. "Elias," she acknowledged, the name unfamiliar on her tongue yet somehow right. "I cannot claim credit for changes that arose from your own heart. The warmth was always there, merely banked beneath grief's ashes." He smiled then, a true smile that transformed his countenance entirely, revealing the man Isolde had described in her journal entries. "You possess remarkable perception for one so young." "Not perception," she countered, "merely attention. The world reveals itself to those willing to observe closely." Night had fallen completely when they reached the outskirts of York, the city's ancient walls outlined against the star-strewn sky. The carriage slowed as it entered narrower streets, gaslight from newly lit lamps casting intermittent illumination through the windows. "Tomorrow we continue to London," the Duke observed, his tone suggesting reluctance at the journey's imminent conclusion. "The Countess is a remarkable woman, formidable intellect, considerable influence in certain circles. You will find her demanding, but fair. I shall endeavor to prove worthy of your recommendation." "Of that I have no doubt." His gaze lingered on her face, memorizing features soon to become memory, rather than daily presence. "London society operates by different rules than Yorkshire. Position determines worth. Appearances matter more than substance. I understand my place, Your Grace. Leora deliberately resumed formality, a gentle reminder of reality beyond their temporary cocoon of privacy. I shall remember my origins and conduct myself accordingly. Something like regret flickered across his features at her withdrawal behind propriety's shield. The season ends in June, he said after a moment. I returned to Whitmere thereafter. The unspoken question hung between them. Would she return as well? The future stretched before them, unwritten as yet. The Duke's potential marriage, her new position, the inexorable demands of their respective stations. The winter roses will bloom again in December, she replied, offering neither promise nor refusal, merely acknowledgement of time's passage and the certainty of season's return. The carriage turned into the courtyard of York's finest posting house, where rooms had been secured for their overnight stay. As it rolled to a stop, the Duke reached across the space between them, his ungloved hand capturing hers in a gesture of startling intimacy. Whatever comes, he said quietly, know that you have left indelible mark upon Whitmere and its master. Before she could respond, he released her hand and opened the carriage door, stepping out to instruct waiting servants. The moment of connection passed, reality reasserting itself in the bustle of arrival. Yet as Leora descended from the carriage, guided by the Duke's properly gloved hand, now offered informal assistance, something remained altered between them, a recognition impossible to express in society's limited vocabulary, yet understood by both with perfect clarity. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human concerns, yet somehow offering silent witness to connections formed and choices yet unmade. Winter retreated, spring advanced, and in the space between seasons, possibility bloomed like flowers pushing through melting snow, persistent, determined, alive with promise. Epilogue. 5 years later, the winter roses bloomed at Whitmere Hall with unusual abundance. December snow lay thick upon the ground, transforming the estate into a landscape of pristine white, broken only by the dark line of the carriage drive. Inside the glass house, white blossoms defied winter's dominion, their perfume filling the warm air with subtle fragrance. Leora Dane moved among them with practiced ease, selecting the finest specimens for cutting. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had found her place in the world. Her simple dress of deep blue wool bore no ornament, save a silver pin at her throat, the key that had been her mother's final gift, now set in twisted silver wire that caught the light as she bent to examine a particularly perfect bloom. "I thought I might find you here," observed a voice from the glasshouse entrance. She turned, a smile warming her features as the Duke of Halowin closed the door behind him, shutting out winter's bite. 5 years had etched fine lines at the corners of his eyes, yet they served only to lend character to a face once frozen in grief, now animated by lived experience. "The roses are particularly fine this season," she replied, adding another bloom to those already gathered in her basket. "Mrs. Williams claims it portends a mild spring. Tenant wisdom often proves more accurate than scientific prediction." He moved through the narrow paths between growing tables, his tall figure incongruous among the delicate blooms. "Her son progresses well at school. His mathematics master speaks highly of his potential. You've received another letter. This morning. The boy shows particular aptitude for engineering." Pride colored his tone, the satisfaction of investment bearing unexpected fruit. "I have written to Cambridge regarding future placement." The mention of letters brought a brief smile to Leora's lips. 5 years of correspondence had flowed between them, beginning with formal reports on the Williams boys' progress, gradually expanding to include estate matters, London politics, literature, music, and finally, the careful exploration of feelings that had first stirred during that frozen winter when a firemaid had brought warmth to a house entombed in grief. Her position with the Dowager Countess of Merryweather had indeed proven fortunate. The formidable old woman had recognized Leora's capabilities immediately, advancing her from companion to personal secretary within months. When the Countess died peacefully 2 years later, she left Leora not only a modest legacy, ensuring financial independence, but also connections in London's literary and intellectual circles where birth mattered less than intellect and character. Those connections had led to unexpected opportunity. Articles published under her own name in respectable journals, a small volume of poetry that had received favorable notice, and finally, a position as assistant to the renowned Lady Marshall, whose scholarly work on medieval manuscripts commanded respect throughout Europe. Through these years of growing accomplishment, The Duke had remained constant presence in her life, first as patron, then as correspondent, and gradually as something less easily defined. Their letters, carefully preserved in chronological order, charted the slow transformation from formal exchanges to intimate communication between equals in all but title. When Lady Marshall's declining health necessitated her retirement to the Yorkshire countryside, Leora had returned to the region of her birth, not to Whitmere initially, but to a small cottage on the Marshall estate some 15 miles distant. The proximity had allowed for occasional meetings, carefully conducted with propriety's boundaries, observed despite the growing certainty of deeper connection. Now standing among winter roses in December light, those years of patient cultivation seemed to reach fruition. The Duke moved closer, his gaze steady upon her face. "I visited Isolde's grave this morning," he said quietly. "For the first time, I found myself speaking to her not of the past, but of the future." Leora's hands stilled upon the roses. "And what future did you discuss?" One she would have approved without reservation. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing not the medallion she had expected, but a small velvet box. "5 years ago, you brought warmth to a house that had forgotten how to feel. You reminded its master that winter, however necessary for certain kinds of growth, must eventually yield to spring." Her breath caught as he opened the box, revealing a ring unlike any she might have imagined, not a diamond of ostentatious size, but a circle of small white stones surrounding a pearl of unusual luster. "Winter roses," she whispered, recognizing the design's inspiration, crafted by London's finest jeweler, who complained bitterly about the difficulty of capturing their essence. A smile touched his lips. "I told him perfection requires patience." He removed the ring from its velvet nest, holding it between them like a question yet unasked. "Society will talk, of course. A duke marrying a woman born to service rather than privilege. My aunt will likely never recover from the shock." "Lady Winters has weathered greater disappointments," Leora observed, remembering the woman's fury when the Duke had returned from his London season without a bride, her subsequent departure for permanent residence with her widowed sister in Bath. "Though I suspect she always feared this outcome, from the moment she observed us together in the library with Keats between us." His smile deepened at the memory. "She possessed greater perception than I credited." Outside, snow began to fall again, large flakes drifting past the glass-house windows like scattered petals. Inside, warmth and fragrance created sanctuary against winter's advance, no longer a fortress of isolation, but a greenhouse nurturing life despite the season. "I have existed between worlds these 5 years," Leora said softly, "neither servant nor equal, neither stranger nor family. A liminal state that allowed connection without commitment. And now I ask you to choose definitive place." He held the ring like a compass pointing toward possible future. "Not as Whitmer's mistress, but as my wife, my duchess, my equal in all matters that signify." The proposal, delivered with characteristic directness, contained no flowery sentiments or grand declarations, only truth, offered without artifice or evasion. In this, as in all things between them, honesty formed the foundation upon which everything else was built. "Society will indeed talk," she echoed, a last acknowledgment of the world's judgment that would inevitably follow such unconventional union. "Are you prepared for consequences to your standing? I have learned that true warmth exists only where authenticity flourishes." His free hand rose to touch the medallion at his throat, that habitual gesture she had observed 1,000 times. "Isolde understood this before I could comprehend its meaning. You helped me remember." With deliberate movement, he unfastened the medallion's chain, opening the golden case to reveal the miniature portrait within. "She wrote of you before you existed," he said softly, "of beauty that persists when all else retreats, of warmth that defies winter's expectation." He closed the medallion and with reverent care placed it among the winter roses in Leora's basket, a symbolic transfer of past love into present keeping. "I shall always honor her memory," he continued. "But I have learned that honor means living fully, not retreating into frozen grief." Leora looked from the medallion to the ring still held between them, understanding the profound significance of both gestures. "I have loved you since you stood in the library and quoted Keats from memory," she admitted, the confession emerging with the freedom of long-withheld truth finally expressed. "Through every letter, every conversation, every silence between, that love has only deepened." She extended her hand, not the passive gesture of acceptance, but the active movement of choosing. "Yes," she said simply. "I will marry you, Elias. Not for title or position, but for the man you have become, for the life we shall build together." The ring slipped onto her finger, a perfect circle of winter roses captured in precious metal and stone, symbol of persistence through adversity, of beauty that defies expectation. His hands enfolded hers, warm despite December's chill, strong with purpose yet gentle in execution. "The household will be shocked," he observed with unexpected humor, "though I suspect Mrs. Holloway has harbored suspicions since receiving your letters addressed to me in personal rather than formal capacity." "Mrs. Holloway possesses wisdom beyond her station," Leora replied, matching his lightness despite the magnitude of the moment. "As do many who serve great houses with faithful hearts." Outside, twilight began its early descent, winter darkness gathering around Whitmere's ancient walls. Yet within the glasshouse, warmth persisted, in the cultivated roses, in the mingled breath of two people standing close together, in the promise of connection that transcended society's rigid boundaries. When he kissed her, it was not the impulsive gesture of momentary passion, but the deliberate act of a man who had calculated every consequence and found the reward worth any price. His lips upon hers carried warmth accumulated through years of patience, heat banked but never extinguished, now allowed to flare into proper flame. "We shall marry in spring," he murmured when they finally parted, "when the whole world renews itself." "With winter roses preserved until then," she agreed, her hand rising to touch his face with newfound freedom, reminding us that beauty persists through the harshest season when properly tended. As darkness fell completely outside, they gathered winter roses together, their movements synchronized by unspoken understanding. The ring upon her finger caught lamplight as she worked, white stones gleaming like stars against the night sky of her dark dress. When they departed the glasshouse together, they carried not only blooms to grace Whitmere's rooms, but also certainty that transcended convention, the knowledge that true warmth arises not from circumstance or station, but from the courage to recognize value where society might least expect it. Snow continued to fall around them as they walked toward the great house, their footprints marking a shared path across pristine white. Behind them, the glass house glowed like a lantern in winter darkness, sheltering beauty that thrived when all else retreated, persistent, determined, alive with promise, just as the heart that dares to love beyond convention's narrow boundaries. In life's coldest seasons, when grief has frozen our capacity to feel, warmth often comes from unexpected sources. The Duke of Halowin encased himself in ice after losing his beloved wife, transforming his home into a monument to grief rather than a celebration of the life they had shared. It took the gentle persistence of a humble fire maid, someone society deemed insignificant, to remind him that honoring love means embracing its warmth, not preserving its absence. True healing begins when we recognize that dignity isn't found in rigid adherence to society's expectations, but in the courage to acknowledge authentic connection regardless of where it originates. Like winter roses blooming against all probability, genuine feelings persist through the harshest circumstances when properly tended. The greatest transformation occurs not through dramatic gestures, but through small, consistent acts of kindness, a fire lit with care, a book remembered, a truth spoken gently. These seemingly insignificant moments can gradually melt the ice around a frozen heart, allowing dormant emotions to flower once again. Perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that we honor those we've lost, not by retreating into grief's cold embrace, but by carrying forward the warmth they brought to our lives. The Duchess understood that beauty persists even in winter. Her legacy lived not in preserved rooms and extinguished fires, but in the capacity for joy she nurtured in those around her. In your own life, consider what winters you may be preserving unnecessarily. What warmth might you be denying yourself out of fear or convention? Remember that the most profound connections often transcend society's rigid boundaries, just as winter roses defy the season's expectations. Call to action. If this tale of frozen grief melting into renewed love touched something within you, I invite you to subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the depths of human emotion and transformation. Each week we bring you carefully crafted narratives that illuminate the beauty found in life's most challenging seasons. Did you recognize yourself in the Duke's frozen grief, or perhaps in Leora's quiet persistence? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your personal reflections often create connections with others, experiencing similar winters of the heart. Remember, like the winter roses that bloom when all else retreats, Your own capacity for renewal remains alive even in life's coldest seasons. By subscribing and sharing these stories, you help cultivate a community where authentic emotion is valued above rigid convention. Until next time, may you find unexpected warmth in your own winters and the courage to nurture it into full bloom.